It's fine.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our interview today between myself, Jess Flarity, and James Stoddard, the writer of The Night Land, a story retold, along with William Hope Hodgson. Just do some quick introductions here. My name is Jess Flarity. I am a PhD candidate in literature at the University of New Hampshire. My dissertation is going to focus on science fiction. Specifically, I'll be looking at science fiction from the 1960s and 70s with sort of an approach to gender. But my interests are, very wide-ranging. And I came upon this book, The Night Land, and I am just fascinated by it. So I'm so happy to have James here today. James is joining us from Texas. Quick intro for you here, James, that I've constructed, but please add anything to it if you feel like there's something I left out. James Stoddard is a fantasy and science fiction writer who is originally from the Oklahoma Panhandle, but now is in a Victorian mansion out in West Texas. He's published multiple short stories online and other places, such as Amazing Stories and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. And he's also been featured in several years' best anthologies. He's also a novelist and has won the Compton Crook Award for his 2009 fantasy novel High House. And he's recently served as a judge for the Philip K. Dick Award, which is an award, I would like to win someday, right? Fingers crossed. Right. He also has a master's degree in liberal studies from the University of Oklahoma, or Oklahoma University. And in 2005, you completed this rewrite of The Night Land. So,
right.
Anything that I left off there you'd like to talk about?
I guess I should mention I'm also a musician. I taught sound recording for years, and I do have an album out based on my novel, The High House, of original songs that I composed called Evenmere. So that was a little sales pitch.
Okay, great. And your website is Evenmere?
www.james-stoddard.com.
Okay, perfect. So hopefully people can, easy to look up. You've got a very professional site. I was impressed. Before we jump into the questions I gave you, I forgot, I think we should just talk about this book really quickly. What is the appeal of this book? Why, what drove you to rewrite it? What's it about? Like, we kind of should just talk about everything really quickly. So here's my understanding. William Hope Hodgson is a weird fiction writer from the turn of the 20th century, and he has finished this book in 1912.
Yes.
And so it's a dark fantasy of the far future, so it's in the dying Earth category, but this was way before any of the other dying Earth books were really a thing, right?
Right.
So very new. It's an adventure story about the last redoubt, a pyramid that is in this dying Earth, the dying sun, a landscape with tons of weird creatures, and he is on a quest to save the love of his life, right? And so it's this sort of high fantasy adventure. What would you add there?
Just that the original is an incredible story, and for somebody to have written it in 1912 with all of the imagination that he did is almost unbelievable.
Yeah, and I think about the discos as being like a precursor to the lightsaber, and just the amount of like the big, there's a huge, not to spoil it too much, but there's a huge scene at the end that when I watch the modern fantasy movies today with giant armies fighting each other, like I really feel like, he captured the essence of that scene way before anyone else. Like no one else was writing about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to this day, I can't read his version or my version without getting, my heart starts to beat a little faster. There was brilliance in what he wrote there at that final scene.
Yeah, it has almost an addictive quality, right? When I read it, it really follows that sort of number one writing rule, which is you always want to keep the reader reading, right?
Right.
Okay, well, before we get back to the book, I just wanted to throw out some questions there for everyone so we can learn a little bit more about your process and how you came to this book. So just first of all, how did you fall into the game of writing, or as James Patrick Kelly calls it, the greatest game that you can play? Because I saw on your website that you've been a Lord of the Rings fan for a long time. So what was your process coming to being a writer?
I was always kind of interested in science fiction. I grew up at a time when the Twilight Zone was first kind of coming out, or actually I was about 5 or 6 whenever it was about toward its end, but Star Trek, all of that kind of thing. And so when I was about 14, I started writing stuff in study hall just for something to do. And I lived in a very small town. There were no bookstores really. And so the only books I could get were off the racks on the grocery store or the drugstore. And so I would read science fiction anthologies and kind of try to write like that. Then when I was about 15 or so, I read The Lord of the Rings, and it was just like, oh, this is what I want to do. This is what the kind of things that I want to write. And so I was immediately addicted at that point, and just kind of went from there.
Yeah, I saw you published your first short story in your 20s, right?
Yeah. I've always been torn between doing music and writing. And so, yeah, I was in my 20s. There was an editor by the name of George Sithers. He's passed away now, but he was the editor of Amazing Stories magazine. And Amazing Stories was a big deal at that time because it had been optioned for television. And so Steven Spielberg was doing an Amazing Stories series at that time. And so to be published there was cool. But Sithers was a very, very nice man. He actually had me do 2 rewrites on it. Here's this kid sending this short story to this editor, and he sends it back. He says, "This is pretty good, but you need to look at this and this and this." So I looked at that. I sent it back. He says, "Still pretty good, but it's kind of esoteric. So try again." So finally he published it. And so I owe him a lot from that.
Yeah, well, that's great to get multiple rewrites. Like,
yeah, you don't get that much these days from editors. They don't have time anymore.
okay. So so you've published a few short stories. When did you first come across the first copy of the Night Land, or maybe William Hope Hodgson? Like, where did this proc on your radar?
I have to explain a little history that when The Lord of the Rings came out, it was published by Ballantine Books in the United States, which was a very small company. It was family owned. Of course, they had distribution, but one of the early paperback companies. And so they wanted to publish more fantasy. Well, there wasn't any to speak of. Nobody was writing it. And so they hired Lynn Carter, who was a writer, to be their editor and to find other books. And so they created a series that went from 1969 to 1974 that was called the Ballantine Books Sign of the Unicorn Adult Fantasy series. And Lynn Carter would go back as far back as he needed to go to create or to publish these books. And so it was a wonderful education for me. As soon as I found the series, usually I had to buy them through catalogs. I got a catalog from Ballantine Books, sent in 50 cents, got the catalog, and then started buying the books by mail, and which was a lot of fun, actually. But anyway, they produced a version of the Night Land. It was somewhat abridged. I have brought along just for your information. Hope I'm doing this right. I'm not seeing myself. So
yeah, I don't see your camera on, just FYI. So
my camera's not on, or
yeah, I just hear your voice. You are
really?
You are James Stoddard. So this is you coming out of the Night Land, if the camera works. This is the Night Land of the internet coming into the real world.
Okay.
Huzzah! Wait. Huzzah! Wait. Huzzah! Oh, and you've even got, yes.
Oh yes, I'm so
Awesome.
sorry you didn't know that. Yes,
Look at the
yes,
background.
I'm here at the Great Pyramid with
You are.
my.
You might just maybe lower the camera a little bit. I guess unless you want to be like, yeah, yeah. Oh, right
Yeah,
there.
there we go.
Perfect.
Okay, now I
Perfect.
can see myself. Yeah.
You're joining us from the Nightland. That's awesome.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah,
No,
this
but
this
that's a cool
artwork is
reveal.
there is a website. It was created by a guy by the name of Andy Robertson, who is passed away now, but he was a Nightland fanatic. And uh, if you look for just Nightland website, you'll see it. But this artwork is by a guy by the name of Isett, Martin Isett. And so anyway, I thought it'd be kind of fun to throw it up there.
Yeah.
But
Looks
anyway,
awesome.
the Valentine books produced. I have to kind of see where I am here.
You have to get the blur right. Like they're still a little blurry. Maybe back them up. You might have to hold them like right by your head.
Yeah, kind of hard to see.
Yeah. Oh, right there. Now that's it. I can see them.
I am
Very
learning so
cool.
much here today. Anyway,
Very 60s covers. Yeah.
yeah, the artwork was very cool. They tended to be very artistic, but they did a lot of different books, and Nightland was one of them. They also did some things like anthologies. I'll show you one of those, where they would take these stories, a lot of them going back 1,000 years or so, fantasy from that era, and it would be things like the Volsunga Saga, the Celtic Mabinogion.
Wow.
William Morris, who's considered the father of fantasy, besides inventing the Morris chair and some other things. And so anyway, they were going really far back. And so I got this tremendous education. And as a 14, 15-year-old looking for fantasy, it never occurred to me that these books were difficult to read. They were what I could get my hands on. And so I thought nothing of William Hope Hodgson's using this archaic language, or the Gormenghast trilogy, which has pretty deep vocabulary. I just read it. And so James Branch Cabell, who was a famous literary author back 100 years ago, he also wrote fantasies. And so I got quite an education just from that series alone.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. I mean, it always blows my mind when I first realized that modern adult fantasy is much younger than science fiction, right? Like science fiction has been going back a long time, but adult fantasy is really, and since the 60s, really has been like its own genre, sort of.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And of course, it really goes back thousands of years, to they didn't always call it fantasy at the time, but
yeah, there's the whole blending into myth, right? So
right. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Okay. Well, that's so fascinating to me, and so cool that you've got like the old school copies of the Nightland.
Yeah, I have a complete set.
I mean, you should have one of the compendiums. And so when did you first say, you know what, this is such a great story, but it needs to get rewritten? Like when did this happen? Imagine like at 2 a.m. At a Waffle House or something, you've had this revelation, or what? So how'd this happen?
I don't really remember the exact moment. It was sort of a gradual thing, I think. But I loved the book so much, and it really dawned on me. This would have been after I wrote The High House and The False House. I thought more people should read this book. And obviously the language was a problem. Even back when it was published, people said this language is a language of Hodgson's own invention. And so I sat down initially and did 3 different versions of one page, each one more modern than the other, trying to figure out, okay, how would I do this? And then, of course, there became questions of copyright and some things like that that I had to kind of figure out. And so I put it aside for a while, but eventually I just decided, okay, I'm going to do this. Now, anybody that had a real good capitalistic sense would not go out and rewrite somebody else's book. Try to explain to your agent or your editor that yes, I've rewritten this book from 1912 and you should publish it.
Yeah.
Anyway. So even after I rewrote it, I really hung on to it for a while, trying to find even a small press publisher, and different people would show interest and then they wouldn't. So I ended up self-publishing the thing.